The millionaire's son lay still on the marble floor, his eyes shut, his body cold with shock, while the maid knelt beside him, her hands trembling, holding something small, dark, and alive. "Sandra, what did you do?" The butler gasped, frozen in fear. Footsteps thundered through the long hallway, growing louder by the second. Then, the heavy doors swung open. Robert Wilson, the man whose money could buy almost anything, rushed in with panic written across his face. "What happened to my son?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the high walls. Sandra looked up slowly, tears filling her eyes. "I didn't hurt him, sir," she whispered, shaking. "I swear, I was only trying to help." "Help?" Robert barked, stepping closer. "You touched my son? You went near him without my permission?" Sandra slowly opened her palm. Inside was something strange and wet, glistening under the light. Everyone in the room froze. The air grew heavy, silent, and thick with fear. Then, a sound broke through it, a sound no one had ever heard before. "Dad!" It came from the boy. The same boy who had been born deaf. The same boy who had never spoken a single word in his life. For a long moment, no one moved. Robert stood frozen, staring at his son. That was when he realized the maid had just done something impossible. This is where it all began. The Wilson mansion was a place where silence ruled. Every corner shined like glass, every chandelier sparkled, and yet, something was missing. The house was grand, but it carried an emptiness that even the most expensive decorations couldn't fill. The servants walked quietly, careful not to make a sound. They all knew that Mr. Wilson preferred silence. Not because it was peaceful, but because it reminded him of his son. Robert Wilson was a man who lived by control. Every day of his life was filled with schedules, business calls, and meetings worth millions. He looked calm to the world, but every night he lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about the one thing his money could never fix: his only son, Ethan. Ethan had been born deaf. From the moment he came into the world, doctors said there was nothing to be done. Robert refused to believe that. He flew Ethan across countries, paid for the best specialists, and tried every treatment he could find. But no matter what he did, Ethan remained trapped in silence. The boy grew, but so did the distance between them. Ethan never heard the sound of rain or his father's voice calling his name. He had never spoken, never sung, never laughed aloud. Sometimes he would sit by the window, pressing his ear against the glass, watching the trees move as if they were whispering secrets he could not hear. The mansion staff had learned a few signs to speak to him, but most didn't bother. Some pitied him, others feared him, as if his silence was a curse. But one person didn't. Her name was Sandra. Sandra was new to the mansion, a young black maid in her mid-20s. She had come looking for work after her mother's illness left her with hospital bills she couldn't pay. She was quiet, humble, and hard-working. Every night, she washed her uniform by hand and tied her hair neatly into a bun. She was polite to everyone, never complained, never gossiped. But behind her calm eyes lived a pain she tried hard to hide. Years ago, Sandra had a little brother named Daniel. He lost his hearing when they were children after a terrible infection. The doctors turned them away because their mother couldn't pay. Sandra had watched Daniel's eyes fill with fear as the world went silent around him. She had watched him die without hearing her voice one last time. That memory followed her everywhere. From that day, she made herself a promise. If she ever met another child like him, she would never walk away. The first time she saw Ethan, he was sitting alone at the bottom of the marble staircase, arranging his toy cars in a perfect line. He didn't look up when she passed, but she noticed the sadness in his eyes. He looked too still, too serious for a boy his age. Something inside her broke a little. From then, Sandra began leaving small surprises for him: a folded paper bird, a chocolate wrapped in gold, a tiny drawing of a smiling face. At first, Ethan ignored them. But a few days later, she found the chocolate gone and the paper bird sitting beside his toys. Slowly, something began to change. When Sandra cleaned near the staircase, Ethan would watch her through the glass window. She'd smile and wave, and he'd shyly lift his hand to wave back. One afternoon, she dropped a cup, and it rolled across the floor. Ethan covered his mouth, laughing silently, shaking with joy. It was the first time anyone had seen him smile. Day after day, Sandra became the only person Ethan trusted. She learned his signs, and he learned to read her lips. They didn't need words. She saw him as a boy, not a sickness. She gave him attention, kindness, and care, something no one else had given him before. But not everyone liked it. One evening, while Sandra was cleaning the dining table, the butler walked in and spoke sharply. "You should stay away from him," he warned. "Mr. Wilson doesn't like the staff getting too close." Sandra looked up quietly. "But he's happier now," she said softly. "That's not your job," the butler snapped. "You're here to clean, not to care." Sandra lowered her head, but inside, she disagreed. She knew the look of loneliness, and she saw it every time Ethan's eyes met hers. That night, she sat by the kitchen window, thinking about her brother Daniel. His face came back to her, small and weak, his lips moving without sound. Her heart felt heavy. She whispered, "I won't let another child suffer like that again." The next morning, when she saw Ethan in the garden, he was scratching his ear and frowning. Sandra knelt beside him and gently signed, "Are you okay?" He shook his head, touching his ear again, his eyes filled with pain. Sandra leaned closer, tilting his head toward the sunlight. For a second, she saw something deep inside his ear, something dark that glistened faintly. Her heart stopped. She blinked, but when she looked again, it was gone. Maybe she imagined it, she thought. She wanted to tell Robert, but Ethan shook his head quickly and signed, "No doctors." His hands trembled. His eyes filled with fear. Sandra froze. He wasn't just afraid, he was terrified. That night, she couldn't sleep. The image of that dark thing inside his ear haunted her. She sat on her bed, whispering, "Lord, what should I do?" The clock ticked slowly beside her, each sound echoing her worry. She didn't know it yet, but what she would do next would change their lives forever. 1. That night, the mansion was quiet again. The lights were dim, and the long hallways echoed softly with the ticking of the wall clock. Sandra lay awake in her small room behind the laundry area, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts refused to rest. She could still see Ethan's frightened face, his small hands pressed to his ear, the shadow she thought she saw inside it. She turned on her side and whispered to herself, "If it's something serious, what if no one helps him?" She thought of going to Robert Wilson, but she knew he wouldn't listen. To him, she was just a maid, another worker who polished floors and changed sheets. He barely even looked her way. She remembered how cold his eyes had been when she tried to speak about Ethan the first time. Her heart sank, and she whispered, "He only trusts doctors, not people like me." But deep inside, she knew something was wrong. The boy's pain wasn't normal. She had seen sickness before, she had seen fear, and what she saw in Ethan's eyes that morning felt like both. She couldn't sit back and pretend she didn't care. Not again. Not after Daniel. Hours passed slowly. The moonlight slipped through the window, drawing faint shapes on the wall. Sandra sat up, her hands shaking slightly. She felt torn between fear and duty. "God," she whispered softly, "if you want me to help him, show me how." In another part of the mansion, Robert Wilson sat alone in his study, his tie loosened, his face hard and tired. The room was full of awards, photos, and books, but none of it brought him peace. He looked at the framed picture on his desk, his wife, holding a baby Ethan years ago. His eyes softened for a moment. Then he closed them and rubbed his forehead. Every time he thought of his son, a mix of pain and guilt filled him. He had spent millions trying to fix what life had broken, but it was never enough. No doctor had ever brought his son a single sound. Somewhere along the line, he stopped hoping and started accepting silence as normal. Yet lately, he had noticed a change. Ethan smiled more, looked brighter, as if someone had lit a small candle in his lonely world. Robert had no idea that the one who had brought that light was the quiet maid he hardly noticed. Back in her room, Sandra sat on the edge of her bed, still fully dressed. Her thoughts were loud, her heart heavy. "I promised myself," she murmured, "I wouldn't watch another child suffer." The night dragged on. Finally, she stood up, slipped her feet into her shoes, and walked out of her room. The hallway was dimly lit, the air cool and still. Every step she took sounded louder than it should. When she reached Ethan's door, she paused. The door was slightly open, and the small lamp beside his bed cast a warm glow. Ethan was awake. He sat up, his little hands pressed to his ear, his eyes wet with tears. Sandra's heart squeezed. She stepped quietly inside. "It hurts again," she whispered softly, her voice trembling. He looked at her and nodded weakly. Sandra knelt beside his bed and signed, "Let me see." Ethan hesitated, but after a moment he leaned forward. She gently moved his hair aside and tilted his head toward the light. Her breath caught when she saw it again, that same dark shape, glistening deep inside his ear. This time she was sure it was real. Something was moving. Sandra swallowed hard. She whispered, "It's okay, I'll help you." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver pin she used to fix her uniform buttons. Her hands trembled as she held it. "Just stay still, okay?" she said quietly. Ethan nodded, his small fingers gripping the blanket tightly. She took a deep breath, whispered a prayer, and slowly brought the pin closer. Her hand shook so badly she had to pause and steady herself. The shape inside seemed to move deeper, as if it was alive and hiding. "Please, God," she whispered again, "guide my hand." Just then, a soft sound broke the silence. The door creaked open behind her. Sandra froze, her heart jumping. She turned slowly, and there he was, Robert Wilson, standing at the doorway in his suit, his face sharp and unreadable. "What are you doing?" His voice was low but heavy, the kind that could crush a person's courage. Sandra quickly stood up, hiding the silver pin behind her back. "Sir, I'm sorry," she said softly, shaking. "He was in pain. I was only trying to help him." Robert's eyes moved from her to his son. Ethan sat on the bed, clutching his ear and looking frightened. "You're not a doctor," Robert said firmly. "If something is wrong with my son, you call me, not act on your own." "Yes, sir," Sandra said, lowering her head. "I understand." He sighed deeply, rubbing his forehead. His voice softened slightly, but still carried command. "You people always think you can fix things. I've had too many who promised to help him, and all they did was fail." He turned away for a moment, then said coldly, "Go to your room, Sandra. Don't come near him again." She wanted to explain, to tell him about what she saw, but his tone told her not to. She turned and walked out slowly, her steps heavy. When she reached the hallway, tears filled her eyes. She leaned against the wall and whispered, "He doesn't understand how much that boy is hurting." She covered her face with her hands and stayed there for a long time, crying quietly. In Ethan's room, Robert sat beside his son, touching his shoulder gently. "It's okay, son," he said softly. "No one will bother you." But deep inside, his own heart felt uneasy. He didn't trust people easily, but something about the look in Sandra's eyes stayed with him. Later that night, the mansion returned to silence. The servants went to sleep, the guards stood outside like statues, and the big house breathed quietly. But Sandra couldn't close her eyes. She sat on her bed, her Bible open beside her, whispering prayers. The sound of the ticking clock filled the small room again. She thought of Daniel, her brother, and how helpless she had been when he needed her most. She remembered how his hand had gone still in hers, how she had begged for help that never came. Her eyes filled with tears again. "Not this time," she whispered. "I can't lose another child to silence." The night grew colder. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, lost in thought. Finally, she stood up again. She couldn't rest. Her heart wouldn't let her. She walked slowly back through the hallway, her bare feet silent against the cold marble floor. The mansion was dark except for the soft light coming from Ethan's room. She stopped outside his door, breathing deeply. Her hand trembled as she pushed it open a little. Inside, the boy sat awake again, holding his ear and wincing. Sandra stepped in quietly. "It still hurts?" she signed gently. Ethan nodded, his eyes begged for help. Sandra swallowed, her voice shaking. "All right," she whispered. "I'll help you." What she didn't know was that the small act she was about to do, driven by love and courage, would change all their lives before the night ended. Sandra's heart pounded as she knelt beside Ethan's bed. The small lamp by the nightstand gave off a faint golden glow that made the boy's face look pale and scared. He sat still, clutching his blanket, his eyes begging her to make the pain stop. Sandra's hands trembled, but she whispered softly, "It's okay, I won't hurt you." She leaned closer, gently brushing his hair aside, and tilted his head toward the light. The thing inside his ear was clearer now, dark and wet, glistening faintly as if it had life in it. Sandra froze for a moment, whispering, "Dear Lord, what is that?" Her voice shook, but she couldn't back away. Ethan whimpered, small tears forming at the corners of his eyes. Sandra swallowed hard, praying quietly under her breath, "Please, guide my hand." She held the silver pin tightly, her fingers shaking. Her breath came slow, and her heart felt heavy in her chest. "Just hold still, okay?" she said gently, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded weakly. Sandra steadied her hand and slowly moved the pin closer to his ear. The air in the room felt still, almost afraid to move. When the tip touched the dark shape, she felt something soft and sticky. Carefully, she hooked it and pulled slowly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then something slid out, small and wet, landing in her palm. Sandra gasped. It was black and round, and to her horror, it moved slightly. Her hand trembled. "Oh my God!" she whispered, staring at it. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it wasn't supposed to be inside a child's ear. She stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. Ethan blinked, confused. He lifted his hand to his ear and touched it gently. Then, suddenly, his mouth opened. A rough sound came out, weak and broken, but real. Sandra's eyes widened in disbelief. She leaned closer. "Ethan?" she whispered. The boy's lips moved again. "Grace," he said softly, his voice shaky and uneven, but clear enough to understand. Sandra's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "You spoke," she whispered. "You can hear me?" Ethan's hands flew to his ears as the ticking clock on the wall filled the quiet room. His eyes went wide, his face full of surprise and fear. "Sound," he said softly, pointing toward the clock. Sandra nodded quickly, smiling through her tears. "Yes, that sound, Ethan. You can hear it." She laughed and cried at the same time, unable to believe what was happening. Ethan looked around, startled by every little sound, the creak of the bed, the rustle of the curtains, the hum of the air conditioner. "It's okay," Sandra said, moving closer, her voice trembling. "It's okay, you're hearing for the first time." The door behind her creaked again, but she didn't notice. A shadow appeared in the doorway. The butler stood frozen, his eyes wide. "What on earth?" he whispered. Sandra turned quickly. "Please don't shout," she said in a shaky voice. "He can hear now. I don't know how, but he can hear." But the butler didn't believe her. His voice rose in alarm. "Mr. Wilson, come quickly." The loud voice made Ethan flinch. He covered his ears and whimpered, frightened by the sudden noise. Sandra hugged him gently, whispering, "It's okay. Don't be scared." Heavy footsteps echoed through the hall. Robert Wilson appeared in the doorway, his face pale and angry. "What's going on here?" he demanded. The butler pointed at Sandra. "Sir." She was touching him again. "And look at the boy." Robert's eyes moved from the butler to his son. Ethan was sitting up in bed, shaking, his lips moving as if trying to say something. Then, in a small, trembling voice, one word came out. "Dad." The room went still. Robert's breath caught. His body froze completely. He stared at his son, unable to believe what he had just heard. Sandra's tears rolled down her cheeks. "He can hear, sir," she whispered. "He really can." Robert didn't move. The butler looked from the boy to Sandra, speechless. The ticking clock seemed to stop for that moment. Then Ethan spoke again, his voice weak but clear. "Dad, don't be mad." Robert staggered slightly, his knees almost giving way. His eyes glistened with tears that he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years. "That's my boy's voice," he whispered, his throat tight. But the shock quickly turned into confusion and fear. His tone changed. "What did you do to him? What did you put in his ear?" Sandra shook her head quickly, crying. "I didn't hurt him, sir. I only pulled out something that was inside. Please believe me." "Something?" Robert snapped. "You could have killed him." Before she could explain, the sound of running feet filled the hallway. Security guards rushed in, standing by the door, waiting for orders. "Sir, please," Sandra cried, her voice breaking. "Listen to me. He can hear now." But Robert's expression was cold. "Take her away," he ordered. "Dad, no!" Ethan shouted suddenly, his voice loud and full of emotion. It was the first strong word he had ever spoken, and it froze everyone in place for a moment. Sandra turned to him, tears streaming. "It's okay," she whispered as the guards grabbed her arms. Ethan struggled, crying loudly for the first time in his life. "Sandra!" he shouted. "Sandra!" But the guards pulled her away, dragging her down the hall. Her cries echoed in the silence as Ethan's sobs filled the air. It was the most heartbreaking sound the mansion had ever heard. In the security room, Sandra sat on a wooden chair, her wrists cuffed together. Her cheeks were wet with tears. She could still hear Ethan's voice in her head, the way he had called her name. It was the sound she had never thought she'd hear, both beautiful and painful at once. "God," she whispered, looking up at the ceiling. "Please help them see I didn't hurt him." Outside, chaos filled the mansion. Robert was pacing the living room, his face pale, his hands shaking. His mind was spinning with fear and disbelief. He had heard his son's voice, something every doctor had said was impossible. He wanted to believe it was a miracle, but part of him was terrified it wasn't. The butler spoke quietly beside him. "Sir, maybe we should call the hospital. The boy might be in danger." Robert nodded quickly. "Yes, call them now. Tell them to send an ambulance. I want every specialist ready." Minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the driveway. Paramedics rushed inside with stretchers and medical bags. They gently lifted Ethan, who clung to his father's sleeve. "Dad," he said softly, his small voice trembling. "Sandra helped me." Robert's eyes filled with confusion and guilt. He couldn't look at her as she was led away. He followed the stretcher outside, torn between fear and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, the impossible had happened. That night, as the ambulance drove away, the mansion stood still. The silence that had once felt like comfort now felt like punishment. And for the first time in years, Robert Wilson wasn't sure if he could face what tomorrow would bring. The bright lights of the hospital hallway made everything feel too sharp, too real. Robert Wilson stood behind the glass wall of the emergency room, his hands pressed together, watching as doctors moved quickly around his son. Machines beeped softly, nurses whispered, and Ethan lay still on the white bed, wires attached to his small chest. Robert's mind was spinning. Every sound in that room, the footsteps, the voices, the heartbeat monitor, felt like a test of reality. For 10 years, his son had lived in complete silence. And now he had spoken. He had called him Dad. He could still hear the maid's voice echoing in his head. "He can hear, sir." He wanted to believe it, but fear and confusion battled inside him. What if she had hurt him? What if she had done something reckless? He had spent years protecting his son, but tonight he didn't even know what he was protecting him from. A doctor stepped out of the room, holding a clipboard. "Mr. Wilson," he said carefully, "we ran some quick tests. Your son's hearing has returned for now." Robert frowned. "For now? What does that mean?" The doctor hesitated. "We found signs of irritation in his ear, and traces of something foreign, something biological. It might have been there for years." Robert's stomach twisted. "Years? You mean all this time? Every doctor I've paid, every test we've done, and no one noticed?" The doctor looked away. "Sometimes these things are complicated, sir. We'll need to run more tests." "Complicated?" Robert's voice shook with anger. "I paid millions. You told me he'd never hear, and now a maid fixes what you couldn't?" The doctor lowered his eyes. "Mr. Wilson, please." But Robert turned away, his hands trembling. He didn't want to hear any more excuses. He walked down the hallway and sat on a bench, his face buried in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt completely lost. Moments later, another doctor walked up to him, holding a folder. "Sir," he said quietly, "there's something you need to see." Robert took the folder with shaking hands. Inside were reports signed and stamped medical files from different hospitals. As he flipped through them, his eyes moved faster and faster. Then he stopped. At the bottom of one page were words that made his heart drop. "Maintain diagnosis for continued funding approval. Wilson account remains active." He read it again, his breath catching. The papers revealed that his son's condition had been left untreated on purpose. They had kept Ethan deaf to keep the money coming. Robert's hands tightened on the folder until the papers crumpled. "You monsters!" he whispered, his voice breaking. "You used my son for profit." The doctor beside him sighed heavily. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wilson. I didn't know about this. The board controls those accounts." Robert didn't answer. He stood up slowly, his eyes red with fury and guilt. For years, he had believed in them. For years, he had trusted every promise they made. He had let his son suffer while others made money from his pain. When he reached the door of Ethan's room, he stopped. Through the glass, he could see his son sitting up, a bandage on his ear. The boy's face looked weak but peaceful. Then Ethan looked up and saw him. "Dad," he said softly, his voice small but steady. Robert froze. His throat tightened and tears filled his eyes. He stepped inside slowly, sitting down beside his son's bed. His hands trembled as he touched the boy's face. "You can really hear me?" he whispered. Ethan nodded and smiled faintly. "Where's Sandra?" he asked. The question hit Robert like a knife. He looked down, unable to speak. "She's not here right now," he finally said. "Bring her," Ethan said gently. "She helped me. She's not bad." Robert swallowed hard. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then he stood up and turned to the nurse at the door. "Tell the guards to release the maid," he said quietly. "Bring her here." Minutes later, the door opened again. Sandra walked in slowly, her wrists free, her face pale but calm. Her eyes looked tired, like someone who had cried until no more tears would come. Ethan's face lit up the moment he saw her. "Sandra!" he called softly, his voice weak but full of joy. Sandra covered her mouth, gasping. "You can still speak," she whispered, walking closer. Ethan laughed softly. "You helped me." Robert stood silently, watching the two of them. His chest tightened. Something inside him cracked open. The anger, the guilt, the pride, it all began to fade. What replaced it was humility and sorrow. He looked at Sandra. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. "How did you even think to look inside his ear?" Sandra hesitated, her voice trembling. "He kept touching it every day. He was in pain. I thought maybe something small was stuck inside. I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't just stand by and watch." Robert's eyes softened. "And you pulled that thing out?" She nodded. "I don't know what it was, sir. It looked alive. Maybe it had been there a long time." Robert turned toward the doctor again, his voice shaking. "All these years, and none of you found it? Not once?" The doctor sighed. "This shouldn't have happened. I'm truly sorry." Robert exhaled deeply, wiping his face. He looked at Sandra again, his voice lower now. "You saw what no one else did because you cared enough to look." Sandra lowered her eyes. "I didn't do it for thanks, sir. I did it because I couldn't let him suffer." Robert looked at her for a long moment. Then he whispered, "I thought money could fix everything. I was wrong." The room grew quiet. For the first time, the silence didn't feel painful. It felt peaceful. Later that day, Robert called a press conference inside the hospital. Reporters and cameras filled the room. Sandra stood in the back, her hands clasped tightly. Robert stepped up to the microphone, his voice steady. "For 10 years, I was told my son would never hear," he began. "I paid for the best doctors and the best technology money could buy. But last night, a maid in my home did something no expert could. She gave my son back his hearing." The crowd murmured in shock. Cameras flashed. He continued, his tone heavier. "We discovered something even worse. My son's condition wasn't fate. It was profit. He was kept sick so people could keep getting paid." A gasp spread through the room. Robert lifted the folder of medical papers. "These documents prove how greed can blind people from doing what's right. But today, that ends. I am launching a new foundation to provide free medical care for every child with hearing problems, no matter where they come from or what they can afford." Reporters clapped softly, some wiping their eyes. Robert's voice softened. "And the first person I'm hiring to lead this mission is Sandra." The room turned toward her. Sandra froze in disbelief, covering her mouth. Robert smiled at her gently. "She taught me what it means to listen, not with money, but with the heart." After the conference, Robert found Sandra outside the hospital doors. The air was cool, the sun bright. Sandra looked overwhelmed. "Sir," she said softly, "you don't owe me anything. I was only doing what was right." Robert shook his head. "You didn't just help my son. You helped me. You reminded me that love heals where money fails." When they returned to Ethan's room, the boy was awake and smiling. "Sandra," he called. She ran to him and hugged him tightly. "I missed you," he said, his small voice warm. Sandra smiled through her tears. "I missed you too." Robert watched them quietly. For the first time in his life, he understood what real wealth meant. That night, when everyone was asleep, he stood by the window of his study, listening to the sound of the garden fountain outside. For years, that sound had meant nothing, but tonight it meant life. Sandra passed by the doorway softly. "You're still awake?" she asked. Robert smiled faintly. "Just thinking," he said. "About what?" she asked gently. He turned toward her. "About how sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change everything." Sandra smiled and nodded. "That's true, sir." Robert looked at her with gratitude in his eyes. Thank you, Sandra. You didn't just give my son his hearing back, you taught me how to listen." Outside, the fountain kept flowing, the sound gentle and alive. Inside, the Wilson mansion, once a house of silence, had finally become a home filled with love, laughter, and sound that would never be taken for granted again. Dear viewers, this story reminds us that miracles don't always come from power or wealth, but from hearts that truly care. Sandra had no money, no status, yet her love and courage did what the world's richest doctors couldn't. She gave a child his hearing, and a father his heart back. Sometimes, in life, we get so busy chasing success that we forget the people around us who are quietly fighting their own battles. Sandra's story shows that kindness can break walls, that one small act of compassion can heal what money never could. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to believe in hope again. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and what lesson you learned from Sandra's story today. Your comment might inspire someone else to listen with love, just as she did. Because in the end, it's not how much we have that makes us rich, but how deeply we care.